He fought for his country, bled on the battlefield, and was awarded the Purple Heart for his sacrifice. But years later, this same man would die strapped to a gurney, executed by the very nation he once defended. His name, Manuel Manny Babbitt, a war hero turned killer. But was he a violent predator or just another forgotten casualty of war? The truth is far murkier than you think. Welcome to Death Row Diaries. Manuel Pina Babbitt's story doesn't begin with a crime. It begins with a promise. A promise to serve his country, to protect it, to do what was asked of him, no matter the cost. Born on May 3, 1949, in the small town of Wareham, Massachusetts, Manny came from humble beginnings. His early years weren't marked by violence or crime, but by discipline, family, and ambition. Like many young men of his era, he joined the United States Marine Corps, driven by a sense of duty and patriotism. He wasn't just a soldier, he was part of an elite group. Then came Vietnam. In 1968, Manny was deployed to one of the brutalest theaters of war, Quang Tri Province, near the demilitarized zone in Vietnam. He found himself in the middle of the Battle of Khe Sanh, a siege that lasted for months and became one of the most infamous and blood-soaked standoffs in the entire war. Khe Sanh wasn't a typical battlefield. It was a hellscape: bombs, gunfire, napalm, and constant death. The Marines were under siege for 77 days, enduring sniper attacks, mortar shelling, and the psychological toll of being isolated from the outside world. It was here that Manny was gravely wounded, sustaining injuries that would later earn him the Purple Heart. But what no one could see, what no medal could acknowledge, was the damage done to his mind. Manny didn't return home a hero. He returned a ghost, a man haunted by things he couldn't unsee. He suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, though back then it wasn't widely understood, let alone properly diagnosed or treated. There were no therapy sessions, no mental health support, no programs to help him reintegrate into civilian life. There was only silence and survival. Friends and family would later describe how Manny changed after the war. He became paranoid, withdrawn, and prone to violent outbursts. He had nightmares, flashbacks, and episodes where he would become completely detached from reality. At times he spoke to things that weren't there, and at others he would lash out without provocation, unable to distinguish past trauma from the present. And yet he never received help. He slipped through the cracks like so many veterans before and after him. Instead of being treated like a wounded warrior, he was discarded. And that's when things started to spiral. It was 1980, nearly 12 years after Manny returned from Vietnam. By now he had bounced between jobs, shelters, and even hospitals. He was homeless at times, deeply unstable, and battling demons few could understand. In the city of Sacramento, California, an elderly woman named Leah Schendel was living out her golden years. She was 78 years old, quiet, gentle, and entirely unprepared for the terror that was about to enter her life. On a spring night, Manny broke into her home during what would later be described as a string of robberies and burglaries. But this one would turn deadly. What happened next is both horrifying and tragic.
The very next day, Manny committed at least one confirmed sexual assault. This wasn't a single act of desperation. It appeared to be part of a pattern, a string of increasingly violent crimes that pointed to someone out of control. But here's where the story takes a strange turn. When Manny was arrested and questioned, he claimed to have no memory of the attack on Leah. None. He couldn't recall what happened that night, nor could he understand how he ended up linked to multiple crimes in a short span of time. To the public, it sounded like an excuse. To psychologists, it sounded like textbook dissociation, a severe PTSD symptom where individuals mentally check out during trauma or stress. And still, there was no mercy. When Manny Babbitt stood trial for the murder of Leah Schendel, the courtroom became a battleground, not just for guilt or innocence, but for something deeper. Accountability versus trauma. Justice versus compassion. His legal team didn't argue that he didn't commit the crime. They couldn't. The evidence was too strong. Instead, they argued why he did it and what had driven him to such a horrific act. Their defense was built entirely around post-traumatic stress disorder, arguing that Manny had been severely damaged by his combat experiences. They brought in mental health experts who testified about his behavior after the war, his paranoia, hallucinations, memory blackouts, and night terrors. They described how trauma had essentially rewired his brain, turning him into a man who could no longer distinguish friend from foe, safety from danger, reality from delusion. One psychiatrist even stated that Manny believed he was back in Vietnam during the crime, reliving combat, and that Leah Schendel may have been perceived in his mind as an enemy combatant, or worse, a threat to his own life. But not everyone was convinced. The prosecution pushed back hard. They acknowledged Manny's military service, but argued that it didn't excuse what he had done. They said PTSD didn't turn people into rapists or murderers, that Manny knew what he was doing, knew it was wrong, and chose to commit the crimes anyway. They painted him not as a victim of war, but as a calculated predator who hid behind his uniform. They even questioned the timing, asking why, if he was so damaged, he didn't seek help. Why he could carry out robberies with apparent planning and foresight, but then claim amnesia when it came to the murder. It was a brutal back and forth. The victim's family demanded the death penalty. The jury agreed. Despite the testimony, despite the evidence of trauma, and despite his service record, Manny Babbitt was sentenced to death. And that's when the story caught fire. Because this wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about how America treats its veterans, especially the broken ones. After the trial, Manny was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would spend nearly 20 years awaiting execution. But something strange happened while he sat on death row. People started to notice his story. Veterans groups, anti-death penalty advocates, and mental health activists began rallying around Manny, not to excuse his crime, but to raise awareness of how badly the system had failed him. Here was a man who had given everything for his country. He had served with honor, been wounded in battle, and returned home to nothing. He received no help, no support, no understanding. And now he was being put to death by the same country that had trained and then discarded him. The debate grew louder when in 1998, just 1 year before his scheduled execution, Manny was awarded the Purple Heart. Yes, you heard that right. From death row, He received one of the U.S. military's highest honors, given to those wounded or killed in action.
The medal reignited the firestorm. How could the government both honor and execute the same man? Was this justice, or was it hypocrisy? Some were outraged. They believed it was a disgrace to veterans and an insult to Leah Chendel's memory. Others saw it as symbolic, a tragic reminder of how broken the system was. Public figures got involved. Celebrities, clergy, even Nobel Prize winners signed petitions for clemency. They argued that Manny should be spared, not because he was innocent, but because he was sick. Because he was failed by the very institutions that created him. But politics was stronger than mercy. California's governor at the time, Gray Davis, rejected the clemency plea. In his words, "A Purple Heart does not excuse murder." And so, the clock ran out. Should PTSD change how we view violent crimes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This case still divides people, even today. By the time the state of California scheduled Manuel Babbitt's execution, he had spent nearly 2 decades on death row. 2 decades confined to a small cell, reflecting on the choices and the trauma that brought him there. During those years, his supporters continued to fight for clemency, petitioning governors, lobbying lawmakers, and rallying public opinion. But time wasn't on their side. May 3, 1999, marked Manny's 50th birthday. Just 1 day later, the man who had survived a brutal battlefield in Vietnam would face his final moment, this time not at the hands of an enemy soldier, but at the hands of the state he once swore to defend. On May 4th, at San Quentin State Prison, Manny made his final preparations. But instead of requesting a final meal like most death row inmates, he did something different, something that stunned even his harshest critics. He refused his last meal and asked that the $50 allotment be donated to homeless Vietnam veterans. That final act wasn't for sympathy. It was a message, a statement, a reminder of thousands of veterans like him who came home broken, ignored, and abandoned. When the time came, Manny was led into the execution chamber. As he lay strapped to the gurney, surrounded by prison staff, medical personnel, and witnesses, he uttered just 5 words: "I forgive all of you." The lethal injection was administered. At 12:33 a.m. on May 4, 1999, Manuel Babbitt was pronounced dead, just 1 day past his 50th birthday. His body was flown back to Wareham, Massachusetts, where he was buried with full military honors, the same ceremony given to heroes, not criminals. Do you believe Manny's final act, donating his last meal to veterans, was redemption or too little too late? Comment your thoughts below. Manuel Babbitt's execution didn't end the conversation. It ignited a national firestorm, one that questioned not just the death penalty, but the very soul of American justice. How could a man receive a Purple Heart 1 year and a lethal injection the next? How does a country reconcile honoring someone for their sacrifice, then executing them for what that sacrifice eventually did to their mind? To some, his death was necessary justice. A 78-year-old woman was dead, brutally attacked in her own home. No military service or psychological diagnosis could erase that reality. Her family never wavered in their position, Manny deserved the ultimate punishment. But to others, his execution symbolized something far darker. It raised the question, what happens to our soldiers when they come home broken? Veterans groups blasted the state of California for failing to intervene earlier. Mental health experts warned that Manny's story was just the tip of the iceberg. There were thousands of veterans with untreated PTSD, many cycling in and out of the criminal justice system, often invisible until it was too late. The outcry was loud and divisive. National newspapers ran headlines that read, "From war hero to death row. Executed on his birthday. America honored him, then killed him." Even years after his death, Manuel Babbitt became a case study in law schools, ethics classes, and debates about capital punishment. His name was cited in arguments to abolish the death penalty for mentally ill inmates, especially veterans. And still, opinions remained sharply divided. Was he a man destroyed by war, or a monster using trauma as a shield? This case changed how people talk about mental illness and justice. Share this video if you think more stories like this need to be told. Manuel Babbitt's story doesn't fit neatly into a category. He was a Marine, a combat veteran, a Purple Heart recipient, a convicted murderer, a man who begged for forgiveness and gave it freely in the end. He was a symbol of everything that can go right and everything that can go wrong. This has been another case from Death Row Diaries, where every execution tells a deeper story. If you found this story compelling, disturbing, or thought-provoking, go ahead and like the video, comment below, subscribe to catch more true stories from the edge of justice.